Hello, everyone coming in. Thank you for attending. I guess I'll just start with some introductions. Hi all, my name is Paris West, and I'm a marketer here at Cambridge, and I am also part of the EDIB team, that is Equality, Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging team. And welcome to our 2024 Women's History Month event with Professor Christina Wolbrecht, co-author alongside J. Kevin Corder of Century of Votes for Women, American Elections Since Suffrage. Christina Wolbrecht is a professor of political science and the C. Robert Margaret Hanley Family Director of the Notre Dame Washington Program, as well as affiliated faculty in the Gender Studies Program, and a faculty fellow at the Cloud Institute for Civil and Human Rights. Her expertise is in the areas of American politics, gender and women in politics, political parties, and American political development. In addition to multiple articles in A Century of Votes for Women, Wolbrecht is also the author of Counting Women's Ballots, 2016 from Cambridge University Press. And she's also the author of The Politics of Women's Rights, published in 2000 from Princeton, and coming in 2025, See Jane Run, How Women Politicians Matter for Young People, co-authored with David E. Campbell. That is not from Cambridge. So just a reminder to all, this will be recorded, and if you have any questions during the session, please feel free to insert them into the chat, and we'll get to them during the Q&A session afterwards. But I'll pass it on to Christina, and thank you all once again for attending, and hope you enjoyed the chat.
Well, thank you so much, Paris. It's really a pleasure to be here. Cambridge University Press has been enormously important to my career in lots of different ways. I also edited a journal for Cambridge and edited a book series for Cambridge. And I've just really gotten a lot out of those interactions. And so I was, pleased to accept this invitation when it came. So what I'm going to talk about today is mostly going to come out of the last book I published with Cambridge called A Century of Votes for Women. And so I'll go ahead and share that screen. And hopefully you will all be able to see that. Mm-hmm. We're looking at that, not at.
Yeah, that's
okay. I'm looking at my email, so I'm gonna there we go. Here's a little bit better. So which was a book I published with Cambridge, that Kevin and I published with Cambridge, partly to recognize the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote. And so what I want to do today is to highlight some themes about women voters. This book is not just about how women have actually voted over this last 100 years, since we're celebrating Women's History Month this month, but is also about how academics, how the press, how the public have thought about women voters over time, and really sort of the degree to which that's necessarily been accurate. So as you probably know, in 1920, the United States, the Congress passes, and eventually enough states ratify the 19th Amendment to the United States. And the 19th Amendment says, the right to vote shall not be abridged, denied or abridged on account of sex. This is actually the exact same language as the 15th Amendment, which guarantees that the vote shall not be denied or abridged on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so very much in that sort of tradition. I'm only a little bit at the end gonna take a more intersectional lens, but I do want to recognize that at the time of the 19th Amendment's ratification, a number of women were denied the right to vote on the basis of their race or ethnicity. And so it's not quite that all women got to vote with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. It removes sex as a barrier, but left in place, for example, the Jim Crow provisions in the South that systematically denied African American women the right to vote, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was, keep Chinese women from citizenship and voting rights. The treatment of Native Americans during this period meant most Indigenous women could not vote, etc. And so I think that's a really important context to have when we think about how women have voted across this period. Just having access to the vote continued to be contested for a lot of women. With the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which is, it's important to say, the largest extension of the suffrage in all of American history, right? So a number of women could already vote in some states that had granted women the vote before the 19th Amendment. We have this gigantic sort of doubling of the vote in most, doubling of the potential vote in most states in the United States. And so this question, what are women actually going to do with the vote, was very much in people's minds. So I'm going to start by spoiling the outcome, and I'm going to try to argue today about two particular things about women voters. The first is that the stereotypes about who women were and what kind of values and interests they would bring to the ballot box are very persistent across this time. So this is an early anti-suffrage cartoon that's shown here that really sort of makes this point that the things that motivate women are crying babies, hats, men with mustaches, and marriage and all these sorts of things. And so this presumption that women are not like other voters, which is to say like men who think about other more serious things, but they're really motivated by sort of specific interests. The other thing I'm going to try to argue to you, which is also related to the point I was just making about women of color and women of different ethnicities, is that there is no one woman voter. This is actually a famous suffrage magazine, and certainly throughout all of history, I hope to show you American history, we've talked about the woman voter as if she is of one mind, one set of interests, etc. But if we've learned anything from our analysis of women voters, it is that is absolutely not true. So this question about what will women do is consistent across our history, though. So this slide includes headlines from the 1920s all the way up to 2016. Women may decide the election, and I guarantee you I could find you some headlines that said that in 2020. And I've also started to see headlines saying something similar about our upcoming presidential election. The first conclusion about women voters, almost immediately after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, was that women's suffrage had actually been a failure. This may be the only academic talk you see this year that includes references to good housekeeping, but nonetheless, around the world, Harper's Magazine, The Century, which was a Harper's Light magazine, Good Housekeeping, etc., the immediate response was that this great experiment, all these years of activism to get women the right to vote, had really failed in substantial ways. It wasn't just the press that made this conclusion, but what little scholarship there was on how women had used the ballot once granted generally concluded that women weren't very good at using the vote. And in fact, I can tell you, if you read later scholarship, 20, 30, 50 years later, that talks about the 1920s and basically says, women's suffrage didn't amount to much, it'll probably cite to something that cites to something that eventually gets back to this one article, which is a study only of Illinois, for reasons I'll explain in a few minutes, to sort of support that claim. And so part of the impetus of the two books, the two suffrage books I wrote with Kevin and I wrote with Cambridge, was to basically say, do we really know what we think we know? Like, we think we know how women voted right after suffrage, but really the evidence for it is incredibly, incredibly thin. So what did sort of the press and academics and everybody else mean when they said that women's suffrage was a failure? The first thing they meant is that basically women didn't vote, that they worked so hard to get the right to vote, and then they really didn't take advantage of the opportunity that was offered to them. And so this is a quote from this sort of well-known history of the 1920s, a popular history called Only Yesterday. The American woman won the suffrage in 1920. She seemed, it is true, to be very little interested in it once she had it. So the evidence in general supports this claim that women were less interested in using their right to vote than were men. So this is from the study that we published, a 2016 book called Counting Women's Ballots, about how women voted in the 5 elections following suffrage. And as you can see, while both are sort of increasing slightly over time, men's turnout is around 70, almost 70 to over 70%. consistently across these presidential elections, while women's turnout in the purple is lower than 40% in 1920 and only reaches about half of women voting, and so a little less than half by 1936. And so that's a pretty big gap between men's and women's voting. And so it seems like the evidence sort of supports this claim that most women, and in fact, less than a half were very interested in voting once they had that right. The story, however, gets more complicated when we take a deeper look into women voters. And so what this figure is showing you is the turnout rate of women in purple and men in mustard yellow across 10 different states in 1920, the first election in which women had the right to vote in most of these states. And what I want to emphasize to you is the great variation across states. So in Virginia, for example, less than 5% of women turned out to vote in that presidential election. Compare that to places like Missouri and Kentucky. In both of these states, 1920 was the first time that women had opportunities to vote, and almost half of them, and a little more than half of them in Kentucky, turned out to vote. Been told your whole life that voting is not appropriate for women, never had any experience voting before, and more than half of women in these states turned out to vote in those elections. And so the gender gap, the difference between turnout of men and women in those states, is also smaller than we tend to see in other places as well. So the question is, why? Why were women who lived in Virginia so reluctant to turn out to vote in 1920? And why were women in Missouri and Kentucky quite willing at what I think are quite respectable rates to turn out to vote in the very first election in which they were eligible to do so? What I want to argue to you, and the point of Kevin and I's first book, is that it matters a great deal where women lived. And in fact, it turned out that the context in which women were enfranchised mattered more than the fact that they were women. What do I mean by that? I want to emphasize two things that made Virginia and Massachusetts and Connecticut, the places with the lowest levels of women's enfranchisement, different from places like Missouri and Kentucky. The first had to do with legal barriers to voting. As you're probably aware, during the first half of the 20th century throughout the South, but also it's important to say in places like Massachusetts and Connecticut, states had passed a number of laws that limited and restricted access to the ballot. So these included poll taxes. So you had to pay your poll taxes. Not only did you have to pay them, but this comes to the long residency requirements. You often had to pay them far in advance of the election. And those poll taxes accumulated. So if you hadn't paid them in previous years, in order to vote this year, you would have to pay past poll taxes as well as earlier ones. The widespread use of quote literacy tests. Sometimes these were citizenship tests, knowledge of government. Not only were difficult for people with less access to education and information, but were systematically applied differently to, in the South, Black citizens compared to white. And in places like Massachusetts and Connecticut, they were used to keep immigrants for participating in election. It's worth saying that in places like Connecticut and Massachusetts, in 1920, 60% of the population of those states were first or second generation immigrant. And so in the same way that whites in the South sought to keep Blacks from voting, Native, by which I don't mean indigenous, but long-term white Protestants in places like Massachusetts and Connecticut sought to keep immigrants, including Irish immigrants, I have to say that because I'm at Notre Dame, for participating in the election. We have reason to believe that the impact of things like legal barriers to voting might have impacted women more than they impacted men. Why might that be? I want to suggest at least two reasons. One is, if you're a poor household and it's difficult for you to get together the resources to pay a poll tax, you're probably going to prioritize the poll tax for the adult males in the family before you're going to prioritize the poll tax for women, okay? And so while poll taxes worked against lots of people, they probably particularly kept women from the ballot boxes. It's also the case that women were not socialized to see voting as something that they were supposed to do. They often weren't supported in doing it, even after the 19th Amendment, which meant that any barriers that are going to stop people in general probably have an especially strong impact on women. If you've never voted before, you don't know where to go, you don't know what to do, knowing that you're going to have to take a test that will be administered by someone you're unfamiliar with it, is probably going to stop you more than it's going to stop other people. And so in fact, what we see is that barriers to voting particularly discourage women voters. So let me explain what's happening in this graph. So what you see on the left is women voters, where there are restrictive election laws. That's the mustard now, as opposed to places where there were very few barriers to women's voting. And so on the left is women and on the right is men. What I want you to see is that for both women and men, living in a place with few barriers was associated with higher turnout. It affects both of them. But the drop-off between those places with few barriers and those places with restrictive voting laws is even greater for women than it is for men. It definitely knocks down men's turnout a bit, but not nearly as dramatically as it does women. And what that means is that while there's a gender gap in both the less restrictive places and the more restrictive places, that is to say, in every place, men were more likely to turn out, it's a much bigger difference when we look at places that have these more restrictive voting laws. The other characteristic of competition that I want to emphasize to you about the 1920s is the degree of party competition. So this was a period of American history in which there was widespread one-party domination in most states. This was most severe in the American South during this period, where there was really very little Republican Party to speak of. Elections were completely dominated by the Democratic Party. The real contestation happened within the Democratic primaries, in which African Americans were systematically excluded for participation. Most scholars would describe, virtually every scholar would describe, the South during this period as not actually a functioning democracy, but rather an authoritarian regime. While the domination of the Republican Party in the North and the West wasn't quite as strong as we see in the American South, it still was true that overwhelming majorities of state legislatures and of vote turnout, voter behavior in these places that are sort of dark red in my figure here, were dominated by the Republican Party. Again, probably something of a Democratic Party to speak of, but very, very limited. What do we know about competition? It turns out that if everyone knows that no matter what happens on election day, Democrats are going to win or Republicans are going to win, the incentive to turn out to vote gets pretty small, right? If you know who's going to win, why even bother turning out on election day? It's not just people's individual incentives, however, it's also the actions of parties and other groups like labor unions that might mobilize people, go knocking on doors, send them reminders about when the election is going to be, offer them rides to the polls, all those sorts of things. Where elections are competitive, parties and groups put a lot of resources into mobilization. They got to make sure every single one of their supporters can get to the voting booth on election day. In places where their party competition isn't very strong, where one party dominates over all the others, parties frankly don't have to put as much work into mobilizing voters. Third, it's also true that the press doesn't cover these stories as quite as closely, where elections are very, very close as compared to where it's expected to be a blowout on one side or the other. Any of you that have ever lived in a battleground state like Ohio or Florida knows what it's like to live a place where the election is very close, right? There's a million ads, there's all this press coverage. I can tell you in Indiana, which remains a non-competitive state, in the 2020s, as it was in the 1920s, we see very, very few presidential election ads because there really is not very much going on. So we would expect that turnout would be much higher in more competitive states, here the light blue or the light pink, than it would be in these less competitive states, again, the dark blue and the dark red. And this is in fact what we see. And so in a similar graph to what you've just seen, we have women on the left and men on the right. And what you can see is that for both men and women, if you are in a one-party democratic state, you are very unlikely to turn out to vote. You are more likely to turn out to vote in a state that's dominated by the Republican Party, that's in mustard. But by far, we see the highest turnout in those states that are truly competitive, that where there's all these efforts to sort of mobilize people to vote, that is in fact successful. What we do see once again is that non-competitive states are even more demobilizing to women than they are to men. That if you already are not very inclined to vote because you've never voted before, because the social norms say it's not appropriate for women, any sort of barriers like the lack of competition is really going to weigh on you very heavily. Another way to say that is you might think of women as sort of naturally not inclined to vote. And what that means, however, is in those states that are very competitive, where the states are trying to get every woman to the ballot box, they are successful and more women turn out to vote in those states. This, in fact, helps us understand the great difference between, say, Virginia, where women's turnout is so very low, and Kentucky, where it's so very high. So Virginia, completely uncompetitive during this period, dominated by the Democratic Party, and citizens faced a lot of voting restrictions, poll taxes, all those sorts of things. And so women's turnout is particularly low. Men's turnout is also very low in Virginia, it's worth saying. But women's turnout is even lower than that. In Kentucky, on the other hand, the presidential election in Kentucky was decided by 0.05% of the vote in 1920. And so every party and group and candidate had every reason to overcome sex stereotypes and pull every woman they possibly could into the electorate, encourage women to vote to make a difference in the outcome of that election. What this means is that the difference, the gap across states, we always think of a gender gap, but the gap across states was 50 points in 1920, that women who lived in Kentucky were 50 points more likely to turn out to vote than women who lived in Virginia. In comparison, the overall gender gap, how much more likely men were to vote than women, was only 32 points. If you wanted to predict how likely someone was, a woman in particular was, to turn out to vote, well, let me back that up. If you wanted to predict how anybody was likely to vote in 1920, it would be more important to know what state they lived in than to know whether they were men or women. Okay, so again, this idea that women didn't vote gets more complicated once we look at the context, who was encouraging women to vote, what barriers were there, etc. I'll just say quickly in passing that since 1980, women have been more likely to vote than men. This is showing turnout in presidential elections since that day. Women are in the purple and remain more likely to vote than men through until today. It turns out the women are failures argument was not just about turnout. Our friend Frederick Lou Allen goes on to say she voted, but mostly as the unregenerate, which is a great word that you should start using more in everyday conversation, the unregenerate men about her did. What Allen is basically saying is that after all of this hue and cry about getting women the right to vote, they basically, when they did show up, just voted the way men, who already, he's basically suggesting, aren't the most thoughtful voters in the world, basically voted the way that men did. This understanding of women voters persists for a very long time in American politics, for literally decades after women won the right to vote. And the argument became quite focused, not just that women voted like men, but specifically that women voted like their husbands voted. So I have here the first sort of picture is a headline from the Boston Globe in 1920 that men are reported to be telling women how they ought to vote. There are lots of these, but they start very, very much from the beginning. The next headline is from the Detroit Free Press in 1952, basically summarizing how wives voted. They vote as hubby tells them to vote. this was not just a stereotype, but it actually informs what we know about elections from this period, from the 30s, 40s, and 50s in particular. So George Gallup, who's going to more or less invent national polling in the 1930s, systematically, when he surveyed the general population, surveyed fewer women than he did men. Why would he have done this? Basically, Gallup wanted to understand with his surveys, what is the process by which, what are the interests, the issues, the beliefs, etc., that help us explain how people vote on election day. Gallup basically thought there was no reason to asking women these sorts of questions because he already knew how they voted. How will women vote on election day? Just exactly as they were told the night before. And so he needed to spend more time in depth on men's process and men's beliefs and issue preferences and all these sorts of things. Because they were actually going to go through some sort of a logical, thoughtful process, whereas women would just then do what they were told by their husbands. And so there are political scientists that have spent years trying to fix the Gallup polls from this period to deal with this systematic underrepresentation of women. It turned out that it wasn't just George Gallup and headline writers at the Boston Globe or the Detroit Free Press that believed this. If you were lucky enough to be a political scientist studying American politics at any time in the last 60 to 70 years, all of these citations would be absolutely known to you. These are the books and the chapters that founded the study, the systematic study of voting in the United States. Every graduate student has to read them, and their basic understanding of the way that voting works and the role of partisanship and all these other questions remains dominant in how we think about voting to these days. So on one topic, these different authors who use different methods in studying voting agreed on one thing, and that is that, again, women were basically told by their husbands and maybe their fathers how to vote, right? So Campbell, Converse, Miller, and Stokes in The American Voter, a very famous, important book, the wife who votes but otherwise pays little attention to politics tends to leave not only the sifting of information up to her husband, but abides by his ultimate decision about the direction of the vote as well. Phil Converse, the University of Michigan, in the piece that is basically the foundation for public opinion research in the United States, says the wife is very likely to follow her husband's opinions, however imperfectly she may have absorbed their justifications at a more complex level. So these are the first empirical studies of women voters. What then is sort of the empirical basis for these sorts of claims? So I want to look at Berelson, Lazarfeld, and McPhee as just one example. The men discuss politics with their wives. That is, they tell them. Back to that in a second. So I want to point out that in this very short quote, there are actually 4 claims of fact, right? The first, that husbands tell their wives how to vote. They tell them. The second is that men do not particularly respect their wives. They tell them what to do, but they do not particularly respect them. On the side of the wives, there is trust. So the third empirical claim is that women trust their husbands with political matters. And the fourth is, on the side of the husbands, there is a need to reply or guide, that men believe it is their role to guide their husbands in making political decisions. So what does that evidence look like? This is, and you've got to love the old Roman numerals and the handwritten graphs, is basically showing who. Okay, let me back up and say it this way. Looking at married couples and asking them, who do you talk to about politics? And these surveys were done in June and in October. And one of the things that this set of graphs is meant to show you is that people talk a lot more about politics in October than they talk about it in June, right? So before elections, you get a lot more political conversation than you do before. That sounds pretty obvious to you. No one had really shown that before this study. Would you go to a family member to discuss a political question? 53% of women said they were, compared to only 5% of men. Did you discuss politics with a family member? In October, 70% of women say yes, versus just 41% of men. And so when it comes to this claim, this empirical claim, they tell them, Here is the evidence that they're using. These answers to these questions about who do you discuss politics with? Have you talked politics with anyone recently? Who was the last person you discussed the election or the candidates with? Are the actual wording of these questions. It is possible that men were telling their wives how to vote. I want to suggest to you, however, that we cannot make that conclusion from these exact survey questions, right? So it didn't say, women, did your husband tell you how to vote? Or men, were you in these conversations telling your wives how to vote? It literally just asks, who have you talked to politics about recently, right? There's no actual direction of influence in these questions that are being asked. In fact, one might suppose that during this time period, when married women were far less likely to work outside of the home than were men, that simply the likelihood that the person that you're going to talk to about anything, including politics, is going to be a spouse, the other adult who lives in your house, is going to be higher for women than for men who regularly leave their homes and have people to talk, adults to talk to in the rest of their lives, right? Again, entirely possible that men tell their wives how to vote, but this evidence does not directly speak to that question. What the scholars are doing is what we do all the time, is we're looking at the outcome, we're looking at the data we have, and we're asking ourselves, what generates this data? Why do we see these sorts of patterns? And they're making assumptions about the nature of political communication within the household. What about these other 4 empirical claims about men not respecting their wives and wives trusting their husbands, etc.? There are actually no questions in these entire surveys about those particular sort of aspects and those claims. So there's no empirical evidence. All of these things might be true, but we don't know them from the data that's being provided. It is not as if it was not possible for these scholars to have imagined a different set of explanations for the data that they're seeing. This is a really long New York Times article in October of 1956 about women's votes that discusses all sorts of aspects. It makes this claim, which I actually would suggest is supported by the evidence we do have to this day. If married couples tend to vote the same way, and they do, and that is true today, it is because their environment gives them the same orientation rather than because the woman rubber stamps the man's choice. The way I say this to my undergraduates is that my husband and I tend to vote the same in elections. Is that because my husband tells me what to do? Or is that because my husband and I got married in part because we share values, experiences, backgrounds, etc., and that those shared values, etc., are what inform our vote, not that one of us has to tell the other one how to vote on election day. Although I will admit in some of the downvote ballot elections, my husband does pay more attention. So sometimes I do ask him, but don't tell my undergraduates that's true. I want to talk about, we sort of talked about historically, we talked about the 20s, we talked a little bit about the 50s. I want to talk about more recent elections. And I'm going to focus particularly on 2016, in part because if there was ever a year in which men and women should vote differently, counter to what we've seen, it would have been, to most people, 2016. Okay, so the top, I think, is probably Vox. No, maybe that's NPR. I used to know, is a headline. The bottom is 538 back in 2016, right? The Trump-Clinton gender gap could be the largest in more than 60 years. Why did everyone expect to see giant gender differences in 2016? On the one hand, we have the first woman ever nominated by a major political party to run for president, right? Surely this must be deeply inspiring to women, and it's going to lead tons and tons of women to want to vote for the first woman candidate. On the other side, we have a Republican candidate who is credibly accused of sexual assault. In fact, since then, of course, has been found to have committed such in a court of law, says terrible misogynist things about women, acts in terrible and misogynist ways, etc. So, of course, the argument goes, it must be the case that women are going to be, fleeing from the Trump side and going to want to vote for a different candidate. in a preview of what I'm going to argue, I want you to think about the presumption that somehow no men would be repulsed by this behavior. We're doing weird sort of stereotypical assumptions about both women and men. So what happened in 2016? It is worth starting by talking about what the gender gap looks like in presidential elections in general. And this is basically showing the percent of women who voted Democratic minus the percent of men who voted Democratic. What we see, this is starting with the ANES surveys that really began in 1952, is that before the 1960s, women were actually more Republican in their turnout, in their vote choice than were men. This goes back to the 1920s when women first got the right to vote. And it's important to say that this is actually a fairly worldwide phenomenon, that in the first decades after suffrage, women were more likely to vote for center-right parties than they were to vote for center-left parties. I'm happy to talk about why that was, but nonetheless, that was sort of the pattern. What we find, of course, is after the 1960s, and exploding in particular beginning in 1980, is that women have been more likely to vote Democratic than are men. I want to be clear, as I'm going to show in a couple minutes, that doesn't mean that all women voted Democratic. It meant that a higher percentage of women voted Democratic than men voted Democrat, right? And so this is sort of the modern gender gap. Again, this is also something we see around the world, that women are more likely to vote now for left and center-left parties than are men. Or you could say it the other way around. Men are more likely to vote for center-right and right parties than are women. And is really the way we've talked about voting at every level since 1980, when the National Organization for Women looked at this difference and called it the gender gap. So the question then is, this is through 2012. Obviously, we have this really unusual election in 2016, and we've got the first woman nominee, and we've got Donald Trump. And so obviously we're going to expect a giant gender gap in 2016. So I want you to all like prepare yourselves, because I'm going to reveal it to you, and here it goes. Yeah, that's it. The gender gap is not even particularly large in 2016 compared to historically. The largest gender gap we'd had up until that point was 1996, which is the post-Newt Gingrich 94 takeover of the House and the second Clinton election. Why was there no big gender gap in 2016? Well, the press very quickly came up with an answer to that, and that is that basically white women failed to turn away from Donald Trump. They betrayed their sisters, and white women remained, lots of white women voted Republican, even when they had a woman on the Democratic side. This is only a sample of headlines. We saw these headlines all over the place. And so what I want to do now is sort of dig into that a little bit and ask to what extent that white women should be blamed for the fact that there wasn't a bigger gender gap. And the spoiler is going to be that it is certainly the case that majorities of white women vote Republican. It's less clear that that is something specific to Trump in any sort of way. So let's look at more data, because we all know that I love data. I do want to point out that the Cambridge press folks did a gorgeous cover for our book, which you saw in the first thing. And then were nice enough to tell me exactly what colors of yellow and purple were used on the cover, so I could put exactly those colors into the graphs that you've been seeing today. That's where the mustard and the purple come from. So let's talk about gender gaps and racial gaps. So what this graph is showing you right now is in 2012, how white women and white men on the left voted. And on the right, it's showing you how in 2012, which if you'll remember, is going to be the second Obama election against Mitt Romney, who, unlike Donald Trump, the most terrible thing he said about women is that he had binders full of them. So a pretty kind of standard election in terms of misogyny in 2012, and how African Americans, women and men, voted in 2012. I want you to see two things in these figures. The first of the thing I want you to see is that the gap, I'll do the other first thing. The first thing I want you to say is that among both African Americans and white voters in the United States, men are more likely to vote Republican, this is Republican share of the major party vote, than are women. okay? There's a gender gap between both groups, okay? White men, more Republican than white women. Black men, more Republican than Black women. The second thing I want you to see is that the gap between whites and Blacks is enormously more larger. This is why I write books, is enormously bigger than the gap between any gap between men and women, right? So more than half of white women vote Republican in 2012, and a negligible number of Black women vote Republican in 2012. This is just a cavern between these two things. I also want you to see, I lied, there are three things I want you to see, that there is a gender gap among white women and white men in 2012, despite the fact that both of them, in both cases, a majority of white women and a majority of white men vote Republican. Okay, so both of these things can be true at the same thing. Most white women in 2012, not quite 60%, but certainly more than 50%, voted for Republicans. There's a gender gap, however, because very close to 60% of men, white men, voted Republican in 2012, right? So a gender gap means that women and men are voting differently. It doesn't mean that women are overwhelmingly Democratic. And that distinction is super important when we're thinking about race, gender, and voting in the United States. You can have a gender gap. Women are still more Democrat, white women are still more Democratic than our white men, even though a majority of them are voting for the Republican Party. So what happens in 2016? Again, we've got this radical, change. Hillary's running and Donald Trump is the other nominee. The answer is that overall, almost nothing happens. So if you compare white men and women in 2012 to 2016, what I hope your eyes are telling you is that the patterns look extremely similar. When you look at African Americans in 2016, you might think, wow, there's actually an increase in voting for Donald Trump. I think most scholars of race, ethnicity, and politics would tell you that change in African Americans in 2016 was less about the attraction of Donald Trump and more about the fact that when Barack Obama is on the ballot, the overwhelming percentages of African Americans cast their ballots for Barack Obama. And so what we're really seeing in 2016 is more of a return to sort of normal African American support for Republicans, which is to say still very low, but not quite as low as it is when Obama was the Democratic nominee. This looks like a lot of stability, which is sort of shocking, right? Like, I will tell you as a professional political scientist that 2016 was a crazy election, really unprecedented. The good news is we've now had two more, and they're going to have another. We're going to have 20, and now we're going to have 24, also unprecedented in lots of fun ways. But nonetheless, this was the first unprecedented election, and it looks like there's really very little change happening here. What I want to suggest, and this is getting to this point about there is no one woman voter, right? We've already seen that voters are women voters are very different if they're African American as opposed to whether they're white. And now I'm going to add the complication of education. So I told you that the white women all look the same. Now the question is, which white women voted for Trump? Again, we're going to start by looking at 2012. And one thing I want you to see is that when we're talking about whites without a college degree on the left and whites with a college degree on the right, there is still a gender gap. This tends to be very consistent across all different ways that we slice and dice the data, right? So men with a college degree are more likely to vote Republican than are women with a college degree, and the same thing is true for those without a college degree. What you're going to notice is that support for Republicans among whites with a college degree is slightly lower. It looks nothing like that race gap, but slightly lower than we see among those without a college degree. That itself is an enormous historic change, but I'm happy to talk about that at a different time. So what happened in 2016? Here's what I want you to learn from this figure. Amongst both whites without a college degree and whites with a college degree, well, let me say it a different way. Whether or not you have a college degree has a different impact on what your vote looks like in 2016. So among both men and women, those without a college degree became somewhat more likely to vote Republican in 2016. The jump, by the way, is higher for women than it is for men. Among men and women who had a college degree, they became less likely to vote Republican in 2016. So the simplest way to say this is non-college educated whites liked Trump and moved in a Trump direction. College educated whites did not and moved away from Donald Trump. Not dramatically, but they did. What I want you to see is that the movements are bigger for women than they are for men. So if we just look at those without a college degree on the left, there's a slight increase between 2012 and 2016 in non-college educated whites, men, voting for Donald Trump. But the difference is bigger and more statistically significant if we look at white women without a college degree, which is all a long way of saying that when the New York Times is sitting in all of those diners in Pennsylvania trying to understand Trump voters, it should stop talking to the mill workers and start talking to the waitresses in those diners. Those are the people, those women are who sort of pulled Trump ahead in a number of states. Recall that Trump won in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin with 80,000 more votes across all three of those states, right? So it only is going to take this slight increase to sort of help Trump move ahead in those states which have large working class populations. When we look at whites with a college degree, however, the pattern's the opposite. The pattern moves in a different direction, but it's still women where the movement really is. So white men with a college degree become only slightly less likely to vote for Donald Trump, whereas women with a college degree, which are a big part of the story these days, become significantly less likely to vote for Donald Trump. So the question is, was it white women's fault? The answer to that is that it depends on which white women that you're looking at. That college-educated white women actually did sort of move away from the Republican Party, not entirely, which would be a ridiculous thing to expect, but they did. Whereas non-college educated white women were part of sort of the move in the Trump direction in 2016. I'm going to briefly show what these figures look like for Black voters, basically to tell you that we see the same patterns. The problem with data from the American National Election Studies for Black voters is that you already have such a small pool, and when you slice them down to educated versus not educated and men versus women, the reason you see these really wide confidence intervals is that there's just not enough of them, which is why most of the work that Cambridge publishes about Black voters specifically is not from the ANES, it's from studies that do oversamples of Black and Latino and other racial and ethnic groups so that we can be more accurate in our talking about them. I have talked for a long time, so I'm going to just briefly say that most of these patterns sort of kept with themselves in 2020. And so again, if we just look at whites versus Blacks and we look at gender gaps, there isn't a whole ton of movement from 2012 to 2016 to 2020. When we look at just white voters on the basis of college degree, what we see is that those white women without a college degree who swung to Donald Trump in 2016 kind of move away from him a little bit in 2020, whereas women without a college degree who moved away from Trump in 2016 really stay away from Trump in 2020, although it's important to note that there's not a lot of change. They didn't learn much. They're still opposed to Trump in 2020, similar pattern with Black voters, et cetera. I'm happy to talk about any of that. I'm happy to talk about 2024, which would all be speculation, of course. But thank you for your attention and your time.
All right. Thank you so much, Christina. That was incredibly informative. There's certainly some stuff in there that I wasn't familiar with, especially like the poll tax for women in the Northeast. I always associate poll tax with the South and Jim Crow era. So it didn't even cross my mind to think about it in a larger scale. So thank you for that.
The anti-poll tax movement actually got an infusion of white women in the South, though, in the 1920s, not because those white women cared about racial equality at all, but they very much understood that the poll tax was something keeping them from being able to exercise their right to vote.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Um, any attendees, if you have questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat. I have a list of questions that I am happy to ask Christina, but feel free to ask away. But yeah, Christina, I will start. During your research for this book, was there anything that you came across that was, pretty surprising to you and that you weren't anticipating?
So it's worth saying that the research for these two suffrage books I did with Cambridge, 16 and 20, took 20 years. I got an NSF grant to do this research in 1999. And I could tell one story about women in their second books and academia as a place for women, but I won't. And so I think the things that really stand up for me now and that I think are relevant today, are one, to remember how much local context matters. That the dynamics in your state, the laws in your state, et cetera, are going to make a huge difference in who really can exercise the right to vote. I think another conclusion that I knew but became even more strong in doing this research is that the degree to which voting is contested throughout American history, including to today, and that it is not a forward march, that we have gone forward and back and forward and back throughout American history. And that's been really useful. I'll also tell, because you mentioned poll taxes, my favorite story, favorite is kind of a overstatement, about how Jim Crow operated for women in the South. So we have these really detailed reports from Richmond, Virginia. And one of the reasons that the South really resisted women's enfranchisement is that they believed that the same violence and other things that they used to keep Black men from the polls, that white Southerners would be reluctant to use that same violence against Black women. Very sorry to tell you that that did not turn out to be true, is the first thing to be said. But the way that the sort of multifaceted way that Jim Crow worked. So in Richmond, Virginia, as in many southern states, in southern states, you had to register to vote 6 months in advance of the election. Okay. Women get the right to vote at the end of August. The election's in November. That is not 6 months in advance. Now, there are things you can do about this. Massachusetts, lots of other states just had a special session and they said, we're going to open up registrars for women and we're going to waive this rule for women. Okay. So in most states, there were these special sort of processes, including Virginia. Although I can tell you in 4 other southern states, the response to Southerners to women's suffrage was, oh, sorry, you missed the registration. We'll see you in 2024. So in 4 southern states, women actually didn't vote in 1920 because the southern states didn't want them to vote. They did in Virginia. So Richmond set up specific registration offices for women to register to vote in advance of the election. And they set up 6 or 7, 8, 9, 10 white women who would take the registration, or white men, the registration of white women. And you'll be shocked to hear, maybe one register who would take the registration of Black women. Okay, so already no problem for white women to get through. They're not being asked these questions. It's going really easily, right? So already very discriminatory in that sense. Now, of course, there are these long lines outside of the registrar for Black women, right? So you're already making it harder for Black women to register to vote. And then the newspaper would carry all these pictures of the lines outside of the Black women's Black women trying to register and say, white women, look at all these Black women that are trying to register. You better show up and register to counter the influence of these Black women, right? So you're creating the lines yourself, and now you're using it as further justification of Jim Crow. The last thing I want to say is around 2020, there was a lot of talk about the 19th Amendment didn't really enfranchise Black women, right? And then should we celebrate this? And there's obviously, for the reasons I just said, a lot of reason to be sympathetic to that point of view, and that was an important part of the discourse around the 19th Amendment in 2020. My only response would be, and this is why I love that story so much, is we don't, however, want to lose or exclude the fact that there were Black women who registered to vote and cast ballots in Virginia and Georgia and these sorts of places. It was hard as hell. the reasons we just said, but so by recognizing that they had many, many, many more barriers than white women did, we also want to recognize that despite those barriers, there were women, organized women, and campaigns and efforts to ensure that at least some Black women sort of were the barrier breakers. Is that good enough? Of course that's not good enough, but I don't want to miss the fact that there were these women who did all that they could to take advantage of this new right.
Oh, great, thank you. And do you by any chance like know the names of some of those women, or like where I could find that actually?
So the short answer, and this does go back to what it took to gather this data, is that you probably could find some of them. And I'd have to go look. There are people, more historians have done some of that work. The problem is that the vast majority, 90% of African Americans are going to live in the former states of the Confederacy in 1920. And the South kept absolutely abysmal voting records. I know, you're all surprised. Really? The South? How could that be? For a bunch of reasons, right? So one of the reasons when you saw those 10 states, I only had Virginia, is that it was very hard for us to find voting records in any of the other states. And I don't just mean, and I should be clear, again, this is going to be boring to you. We don't actually drop ballots in pink and blue ballot boxes. So the official record, one of the reasons that our book was sort of a contribution is that the official voting records about how men and women voted right for suffrage did not exist. We did not have counts of men versus women. We also did not have very good public opinion polls in the 1920s, or any really. And so all of our, most, I'm going to tell you the exception in just a second, of our knowledge about how women voted was like, you track down the site and it would be a New York Times story about a party leader in upstate New York saying, oh, women just didn't turn out. There must have been 5 men to every 1 woman. Like, I don't, who is this guy and why am I listening to his claims about, about voter turnout? So we didn't have really good data. The exception is the state of Illinois, and Illinois, like actually a number of other states, when they enfranchised women in 1911, they enfranchised them for only a subset of elections. It had to do with the Illinois state constitution. And so Illinois, in fact, you saw that picture of a ballot box, that's actually from a state that did that, actually had separate machines for men and women and separate ballot boxes, as some other states did. Connecticut did this as well, but only in Illinois are they reported separately. So we actually do know women's turnout and vote choice in Illinois in the 1916 and 1920 presidential elections. That turned out to be very important for us with the statistical work that we were doing to estimate women's turnout and vote choice in other sorts of states. We could validate it against Illinois. That is a long way to say that there are states in which we can still get the rosters of names as people signed in to vote. My experience in archives in the South is that that's going to be a lot.
Understandable. I really understand that. I don't know if you have time for a few more questions, but you were talking about the scholars from, I guess, like the 1920s and 1960s, and a lot of them mentioned that women voted the same way as their husbands. Did you find any data about women who weren't married and how they voted, if they voted at all?
That is a great question. And if I could pull out my book and grab the graphs, I could show you, because we do that in each of the chapters, married versus unmarried women. This is an aspect that is really has only become more important in recent times. So my memory, you'd think I'd remember everything in every graph I ever produced, but I do not. My memory is that there's always been a slight difference between married women and unmarried women, but that has become pretty dramatic since the 1980s, which is to say that married women are more likely to vote Republican than unmarried women. That's what that looks like. Now, why might that be? It might be that there's something about marriage that makes people more conservative. And that's actually possible. Like when you have children, when you own a house, lots of things are associated with marriage that suddenly make you care more about taxes than other things or whatever it might be. It's probably the case that the kinds of people who get married are already different than the kinds of people who stay single.
Mm.
There are racial differences, there are class differences, there are regional differences that probably are explaining more of that than the idea that somehow you put a ring on your finger and suddenly you vote for Donald Trump. It's also the case, though, that those differences matter much more today than they did when we first started having systematic data in the 50s. There were just many, many fewer women over the age of 21 who were unmarried, right? This is a period in which that's just what you did, right? Today, you know, even leaving aside cohabitation and other sorts of family structures, there's just a lot more unmarried women than there used to be. And so their voting differently is more consequential than it might have been in the 1950s and the 1960s. But it's exactly the right question to ask about, well, what about unmarried women?
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you. And I've got a few more questions. This is more in line with like very recent voting trends. So, you know, during last year's midterm elections, you know, some states had abortion on ballot and voter turnout happened to be quite high. Do you think having gender and or sex-based referendums on the ballot is a good way to increase voter turnout? Considering that some of these state legislatures are, you know, pulling back on civil rights and civil liberties.
So I love this question, and I'm going to answer it a couple of ways. As you guys can see, I always give a long rambling answer. First thing I want to say is that prior to these abortion referendum and things that have run in various states, so Kansas, Ohio, et cetera, I would say that the consensus understanding of those sorts of ballot initiatives in political science would be that they are not the democracy saving ideas that you might think they are. And that reason is that big interests with lots of money put tons of money into these sorts of campaigns. Voters, you know, we're lucky if voters know the name of candidates. To actually understand these terribly written voter referendum choices, right, is really difficult. And so the companies, the people that can afford the no on one campaigns tend to be successful, right? Because most people are not paying that much attention to politics. They have other things to do with their lives. And so I am a little reluctant as a general rule to basically say, you know, voting on specific issues or referendums or whatever they are is democracy enhancing. It's not always clear that that's the case. I think that the abortion referendum looked different because of the great high salience of those issues. And I think what's interesting about these, so it's, you know, voting for a candidate is always a very indeterminate signal. So a candidate wants to stand up and say, I have a mandate to do X, Y, and Z. But it might be that all the voters voted for you despite your position on Y, right? Like they cared more about X, and you're now trying to say you have a mandate on Y, even though most of your voters were like, no, I don't really like where he stands on Y, right? I voted for him from X, right? So it's fascinating to see in these very Republican states that there's still large majorities that are supporting abortion rights, right? Which is saying, I think it's fair to say that the current post-Dobbs position of the Republican Party on abortion is probably not shared by most Republican voters, or at least there's a sizable percentage of them who do not agree with the most extreme sort of position on abortion rights. Prior to Dobbs, the conventional wisdom in political science was that pro-life voters are more likely to be single issue voters than are pro-choice voters. That there were more people, and I'm at Notre Dame, and so I know some of them, who, whatever they might think about Republicans on other issues, care deeply about the pro-life position on abortion. And so they vote for Republicans for that reason and that reason only. That dynamic has something to do with the status quo versus change, right? If you're a pro-choice voter, the status quo is Roe, the status quo is abortion rights while they're being attacked in different ways, right? Like you don't have to worry about changing something. The way it is probably good for you. And so you're going to go worry about other stuff you want to change. Dobbs changes that dynamic. And now the pro-life people have the status quo, and it's the pro-choice people in states like Kansas and Ohio who want a different status quo. And so that then drives the observation you made about higher turnout, about more support for pro-choice abortion referendum than for Republican candidates. And so this sort of, what side are you on? So if you would ask me the last 6 elections, which people did, is abortion going to change, pro-life or pro-choice voters, blah, 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 I would have said, I can't really count on pro-choice voters. That's not really the motivator. I think we saw in 2022, and it's likely we'll see in 2024, that equation has changed a bit.
Yeah. All right, great. Thank you. And if you have time, I've got 2 more questions for you. Okay. In other democracies around the world, voting is compulsory. Coming to mind is Australia. Has there been any history of possibly implementing, compulsory voting in the US? And like, what do you think about that in general? Just from, political science perspective.
So I don't know if you guys noticed, but Americans really don't like government telling them what to do. So I'm teaching Introduction to American Politics right now, and my students' last paper is about a reform to American democracy that they would make to make the United States more democratic. And I've got Supreme Court justices having 18-year terms. I've got eliminating the Electoral College. I've got voting, lots of things. Nobody is saying compulsory voting, which is interesting. And I don't really see a lot of talk about that in the reform community. Why? One is, again, we don't even help people register. We make people register, right? We don't, there's no reason why everyone could not be automatically registered. They know where you are for your taxes. They count you at every census. There's no reason that we have to do it this way. And other countries do not. And there's good reason to think that would increase voter turnout. What do we know about compulsory voting? There have been studies that have tried to ask what would happen if everyone voted. And the general conclusion is that changing the outcome is pretty unlikely. So it's not as if non-voters aren't different from voters, because they are. Voters are more likely to be educated. They're more likely to live stably in the same place over time. Lots of different characteristics are associated with voter turnout. But it turns out that even if the preferences of non-voters are slightly different, they're rarely different enough. And that's because lots of elections in lots of states, it's not like the voters, the voting people voted 51% for this guy and he won. And if the non-voters come in and vote 51% for the other guy, they're going to swing the thing. It's that the voters voted 60, 65, 70% for this guy. And non-voters might not like him, but that's probably not enough to get past that sort of advantage on the other side, right? I showed that map of one-party control in the 1920s, but we could draw a not entirely dissimilar map of party control in the American states today. So lots of states are dominated by one party or the other. If not there, then at the district level, we see that. And we see that especially because of gerrymandering, right? That has drawn districts to be overwhelmingly one party or the other. The criticism of compulsory voting is that why should people who can't be bothered otherwise do it, or people who don't pay enough attention? Do we really want more uninformed voters participating in elections? The counter to that, among other things, is that we don't require anybody who votes now to take a test to prove that they paid attention, one, and two, that the kind of knowledge that's politically relevant, right? Do I have to study all the characters, the candidates, or do I just have to know that the price of stuff at the grocery store has gone up a lot? And it's gone up a lot under the incumbent, right? Whether or not that's his fault is a different question, but people can know stuff that's politically relevant without being obsessively paying attention to politics.
Right, well, thank you for that. And I guess the final question is, it's been just a little over 100 years since women's suffrage, and we're now entering the 2nd century of women's suffrage in the US. I know you can't tell the future, but what do you think the future has in store for women voters in the United States?
So it is also really exciting time to be a scholar of women in politics. And not just because Donald Trump so embodied discussions of masculinity and femininity in politics that no one can deny the importance of those things anymore. You know, women continue to be more likely to turn out to vote. Black women in particular turn out to vote at extraordinarily high levels, which tells us something really interesting about race and gender and community. We're finally getting to the point of more and more, you know, we're moving beyond token women in political offices to them being more and more normal. We're still having lots of firsts, but we're having less firsts than we did. This book that you mentioned that I literally just finished on Thursday is full of surveys of adolescents. And we show that exposure to a women politician in your own community when you're an adolescent makes you more likely, you're a woman, more likely to vote in your 20s. So it lasts and it persists, which just means that the more women we have in those positions, the more that we're normalizing the idea that politics is something that women do, and political leadership is something to look up to and to try to attain. I don't want to end by being a Debbie Downer, but I would say that said, we've also seen a measurable rise in violence against women in politics. One of the things we show in this book is that Republican boys actually become more engaged in politics, but not because they're inspired, but because of a backlash, of a sense of threat that women politicians pose. Women who run for office still face all the same problems that women professionals face about, you know, double duty at home and at work and stereotypes about, you know, what's appropriate for women, et cetera. So I am optimistic, but I'm also aware that there are lots of people who are not invested in more political power for women.
I agree. Well, thank you so much, Christina, for your time, and thank you to the attendees for attending our Women's History event, Women's History Month event. This will be online soon. And yeah, thank you for such an enlightening talk. And everyone, yeah, you can pick up Christina's book in the office, and nice be on the lookout for her new one, even though it's not published with us. It sounds interesting. So check it out.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. All right. Bye, everyone.